Today we're speaking with Tareq Haddad, who recently made the news by resigning from Newsweek because they would not let him publish the true story of how the supposedly neutral institution and watchdog known as the Organization for the Prohibition of Chemical Weapons knowingly falsified its own report to accuse the Syrian government of carrying out a chemical attack, which perhaps could have led to a U.S. invasion or a full-blown U.S. invasion, regional war, or even world war. Well, you don't have to worry about that because after the recent U.S. airstrike outside the Baghdad International Airport, which killed the renowned Iranian General Qasem Soleimani, it seems we may get another chance at a regional or even world war. Tareq and I will be discussing Iran today, and thank you for joining Geopolitics and Empire for the first time.
Thank you very much for having me on. And it was a pleasure to meet you recently on another podcast where we kind of began this discussion.
Yeah, we spoke with Rico Brouwers, of our friend out in, I think, the Netherlands, from his podcast. And so today we'll be talking about Iran. And just to set a little context, the U.S. launched a few weeks ago airstrikes both in Syria and Iraq, targeting Iranian-backed militias and or Hezbollah. Both Syria and Iraq were furious about this violation of their sovereignty. And then this led to an Iraqi uprising and assault on the U.S. embassy in Baghdad, which today in a communique has told all Americans to depart Iraq. So there's a lot of serious things going on. The Iranian general that was taken out, he was a revered figure. And the airstrike that took him out also, which was, I believe, in or near the Baghdad International Airport, it took out important Iraqi and perhaps other military figures. This for sure is a very deadly escalation by the United States toward a new regional, if not world war. So, Tareq, what do you make of these events?
Sure. I mean, it's tough to say with certainty at the moment, but I think there was probably some sort of understanding that this was in the pipeline for a long time. I think kind of from what I've been looking at, is there's been evidence that, the US and the powers in the region knew that there was about to be a big conflict escalating. I don't think, I wasn't aware of it when I resigned from Newsweek over the scandal at the OPCW, but kind of having conversations with people over the last few days and speaking to other journalists in the region, and a lot of people have reached out to me, giving me certain information. I think the case is that this conflict has kind of been a long time coming, and I can kind of explain some of those specific factors.
Yeah, we'll get into that, and just to talk a little bit of the trivial, superficial aspect, which is on the news. If this wasn't Iran and if it wasn't General Soleimani, I might think this is just President Trump attempting to win votes, akin to perhaps what he did perhaps a year or two ago when he sent, I don't know what, 50, 60 missiles striking into Syria, but they were sent where there was nothing there, so it was just kind of for show. And but it seems, something tells me it's much more. I mean, they took out the Iranian general. This is very serious. And how do you see President Trump's role in this? Not to mention his very active and trivial tweeting on the matter.
Sure. And I think you probably will share a similar view to me here in that, even though that he will have had his part to play, I don't think he's ultimately the key responsible figure in all of this. I think if you look at US foreign policy through the years, I think it's become more and more apparent that it's not really, it doesn't matter who the president is, Democrat or Republican. The Western or the US empire, per se, in the Middle East will kind of do what it's, what it wants to do, and it's part of what I raised in my piece that I wrote about when I resigned from Newsweek. The big problem, and it's been something that's been discussed for a very long time, is this whole idea of the military-industrial complex. What I found at Newsweek is that there was editors with very direct links to think tanks that make money from going to war, and I think essentially the influence of these think tanks has just become so powerful that they really do dictate wider US foreign policy. People like the Council on Foreign Relations, for example, what you'll see with their publications and the things that they put out is all kind of a very good sign of where foreign policy will go. So you'll notice how we started to see propaganda against China with the Uyghur population. Thankfully, some investigative journalist Max Blumenthal, I don't know if you're aware, he wrote a piece about how kind of taking apart those Uyghur accusations, and there's other similar signs like this. But in essence, I think it's Trump's not the key figure in this. I think he's someone that's come into this role, and the kind of military establishment behind him is kind of pushed for this.
Yeah, I would totally agree with you. On my Facebook, I've got some of my old international relations students, commenting. I'm posting the events as they're happening, and they say President Trump, and I'm like, whoa, not to defend President Trump, but if we continue that line of thinking, blaming Trump, it's very misguided. Because we can pin the blame on Trump, but then, as you say, we're not looking at the real root or cause, which is the military-industrial complex or the deep state or whatever you want to call this thing. And it reminds me of JFK, and they pulled the same thing on JFK when was it the Dulles brothers tried to get Kennedy to go into to overthrow Cuba? He fudged that up, I think, intentionally. And look what happened to Kennedy, and who also wanted to pull out of Vietnam and end the Cold War. And so it's the same scenario again with Trump, and then going kind of deeper into this. This just reminded me. I spoke last summer with a Romanian patron and supporter of Geopolitics, an Empire, who called me up for a Skype, and I think he has his own podcast out in Romania. But he asked me some of my views on Iran, and I had told him that I didn't see war with Iran in 2019. But that I thought that a U.S. war on Iran was a sure thing, that it was baked in the cake. And I say this because of the factual and historical precedent that has been borne out. You recently retweeted Peter Hitchens, who has been saying that we are not in a post-war, but a pre-war period, implying that, we're not looking toward a future of peace, but something is coming. Wars are going to start happening again. Former NATO commander and U.S. presidential candidate Wesley Clark revealed to us the 2001 Pentagon project to remove 7 Middle Eastern countries, beginning with Iraq, Syria, Libya, which all have happened so far. Lebanon, where we've recently seen the economy collapse and mass protests initiated, and we've even seen people can go out and see video footage of this. U.S. government officials, I'm not sure if it was someone from the U.S. State Department, were on the streets promoting the overthrow of the Lebanese government. And then finally, we've got Iran. So call me crazy, but we've seen a war on every single one of these countries that they said that they would attack. So I think a rational person will conclude that we're going to see sooner or later a war with Iran. So what do you think the United States is after here? And if you want to go deeper into this, do you see them going through with a full-on war against Iran?
So I had a very interesting conversation yesterday with a Lebanese journalist called, she's not Lebanese, she's American, but she's based in Lebanon, Sharmeen Awari. It really put a lot of things into perspective for me, things that I've read elsewhere. But essentially, I believe, the Chinese and the Russian empires are kind of strengthening their influence in the Middle East. And because of the US failure in Iraq, China has stepped in. I don't know if you're aware. I think they've given them lots of funding. And so I think it's, the Chinese empire has started to do things differently compared to the US empire of kind of using proxies to uphold US interests. China's going for this, this approach of, we'll give you funding, we'll give you the ability to build infrastructure. And that's how we'll try and hope that you'll be kind of, your allegiances will be with us. And so I think what Sharmeen was mentioning yesterday is that now there's a kind of an agreement. I don't know if it's kind of formalized, but an agreement between China, Russia, Iran, those players in that region, of them saying, okay, we're we all have a common interest in protecting the rule of law, international law, and the sovereignty of countries, because they've all been at the kind of felt the repercussions of that. So I think my perspective is, the US project in the Middle East has largely failed. The military and kind of the idea of American supremacy hasn't, they haven't accepted that fact, and instead of just kind of removing themselves from the area, they're going to be kind of clinging on, or they're going to escalate the situation further. But I think it's definitely a clear sign of the US empire's decline, for sure. I saw some figures from the Freedom of the Press Foundation, which kind of shows how many number of journalists killed, and this is in the United States. This is, they've got a new tracker purely to monitor the freedom of the press in the United States. The amount of journalists that are indicted on certain offences. Obviously, we've got things like Snowden and Julian Assange and Reality Winner and all these people. So I think what we're seeing is kind of the US has actually become an authoritarian state that is in decline. And instead of kind of accepting this openly, it's doing what a flailing empire does. It'll start conflict as it's declining all around it, but essentially it's going to lose more and more wars, as you know.
Yeah, I mean, and I would agree with you. I left. I decided to leave the U.S. in 2006 for various reasons. I've mentioned this before, but I kind of saw historically the trend towards. It's an empire. I realized I was living in an empire and it was declining, and you just compare it like to the Roman Empire or whatnot, and it becomes the economy declines. When that happens, when you reach the peak, the economy starts to decline. It starts to become more authoritarian, and people blame it on Trump today, but it's not Trump.
Yeah.
It's a process that's started a long time ago, and it kind of bothers me. I have some Mexican friends. I'm a Mexican citizen myself, but I'm a real ethnic Mexican friends who will say Trump is a Nazi, but I'm like, wait a minute, I left in 2006, like 13 years before Trump. So I saw these things beginning to happen. But anyways, we're digressing from Iran, and I like how you use the term empire for both China and Russia. So let's not be mistaken either. And
it's a global game. It's not a...
Yeah, and the European MEP Guy Verhofstadt recently gave a speech. I'm not a fan of his, but I agreed with what he said, that the future is not a future of nations, but of empires. He said, look at India. It's 1 billion people. That's an empire. China is an empire. The EU is an empire. The US, Russia. So we're dealing with empires here. And then to talk a bit more of the media aspect and what we're going to start seeing going forward, I would like to think that yourself and myself, we try to look at geopolitical events as they are, with as little personal bias or emotion as possible. You can never get rid of that 100%, but before this podcast gets labeled anti-American or some other such insult, let me just remind folks that Iran has not started a war in, I believe, hundreds of years, and it has in recent times been a peaceful country. And it has been the U.S., Europe, and their partners such as Saudi Arabia and Israel, which have initiated fraudulent wars, which have led to the deaths of millions. And just to be fair, yes, Israel in some of those instances was defending itself, and so it had legitimate rights as well to defend itself, Israel, from attacks from its neighboring countries. And sure, Iran has its own problems and may be an oppressive place to live. I don't know. I've never actually visited Iran, but is bombing them and killing millions of people reasonable? So I'm trying to look at this objectively and factually. And let's not forget, again, in the 1980s, the U.S. spurred Saudi Arabia to invade Iran, and they had an 8-year war that killed millions of people there, where the U.S. Was arming both sides. So, considering you've been working in the media, how do you see all of this playing out in the media, the mainstream media? How might the Pentagon leverage the media and prepping Americans and people around the world for yet another war? Will it be harder for the truth to come out? So what's your take on the media today?
Yeah, I mean, in general, and I think most of your listeners will be kind of aware of this. In times of war, it becomes very, very difficult for journalists to say anything that's counter to the government line. And in big wars, that definitely goes up because what happens is any anti-war voices will automatically start being labeled as unpatriotic, and then that will slowly descend. I mean, but the thing is, we've already reached that stage with America of anything that's counter the kind of military line is, Assad apologist, Russian asset, genocide denier. You could go on and on and on. And I mean, reading the news, the mainstream kind of Western news, I've seen very little anti-war voices, and I mean, some of the coverage has been, amazing. I've seen kind of quotes from Nancy Pelosi, the Democrat speaker, um, criticizing Donald Trump for not asking approval from Congress before the strikes. And it was, I think, 2 weeks ago, she was, saying that she wouldn't have impeached. She decided not to impeach George Bush, even though she knew that he lied about Iraq. And then they had this kind of monumental impeachment cock up over, leading up to Christmas. So you can just see the information that's coming out of the US media is just, it doesn't have the ability to be accurate anymore. And I kind of made this reference in a few of my tweets. It seems like, this inability of the US media to really tell the truth about what's going on is really hurting the country, because some of these things could be avoided if you had a kind of a media that was a watchdog. Some of the more flagrant violations of international law would be stopped. But what you've steadily seen, and this has probably gone on for 50 years now, is that America and the UK have been the worst perpetrators of crimes against against international law. And like you said earlier, we're both we're not doing this to defend Russia or defend Syria or anything like that. We probably, and I assume you say this from the same perspective, is that we actually care about the United Kingdom and the United States and the Western kind of model of democracy. And actually the way we see that flourishing is, protecting rule of law, protecting institutions such as the OPCW. I wrote a kind of, just looking back at my old article, I wrote a paragraph that was saying, exactly this, and this was about a month ago, saying why it's so dangerous to weaponize the OPCW. It's supposed to be this neutral watchdog that stops or investigates chemical weapons attacks. And I was saying, the media, it's unacceptable that they're silent on this, and this can have massive implications. And as we're seeing today, I think the OPCW leaks are definitely linked to what we're seeing in Iraq. It's this flagrant, repeated violation of international law, and I think those countries have had enough, essentially, and they're saying, we don't want you in the region anymore.
Yeah, and I would agree with you as well, that we talk this way because we see illegal actions that are unethical, and we care for our own countries in the Western civilization. I'm reminded of, I'm more of a Peter Hitchens type conservative Christian, but I think of William Wilberforce, who was this Christian politician who single-handedly, I believe, helped to end slavery in the British Empire.
Yeah.
So it's like that same idea where it's like, if Syria did carry out a chemical attack, okay, let's do something about it. But I mean, it's not in the Judeo-Christian tradition or other traditions to be falsifying data, and we're supposed to be honest and tell the truth and have integrity, whether we like it or not. Whether what the other person's saying is true, whether we agree or disagree with them, the truth is the truth. So that's kind of the idea. And going just one more thing on the media aspect. You were talking about the journalism in the U.S., what's happening now, and I was kind of shocked. We're talking about Snowden and Julian Assange. Snowden, who's worked in the government and then revealed all this NSA information, which it's unconstitutional, but they were still kind of like state secrets. But I'm thinking now recently of the Gray Zone. I think it's Max Blumenthal. So
Yeah.
he's just this regular guy doing journalism,
Mhm.
and he gets these fake charge. The police just come up to him and invent these charges and put him in jail in the United States. And for me, this is
Mhm.
like something that happens in foreign countries, and that's happening now in the U.S. They're just inventing charges for it's political persecution in the U.S. to a regular
Absolutely.
average guy. So I don't know if you have any final comment on the
Yeah, I mean,
media's.
I was thinking about this. I was due to speak at a vigil for Julian Assange a few weeks ago. It didn't happen in the end just because of we had some timing issues. But I was thinking about this a lot, and while all this was happening, and my thought is that the US essentially has become the countries that it used to hate and lambast and things. The example I couldn't help thinking of was Alexander Solzhenitsyn, of kind of how he went to the US and after speaking out about the horrors in the Soviet Union, and the West was rightfully credited for taking him in, and his story was paraded around. And now we kind of have this polar opposite situation where Snowden is exiled in Russia, and I've seen interviews, and he's happy, living a happy life. He's not obviously he's not pleased about being in Russia. It kind of symbolically, I think it says something that he's living in Russia because he can't tell the truth in America. And I kind of mentioned this in my piece, is that I think freedom of speech is very quickly dying in the United States, and if it has any hope of having a successful resolution to all of this, I think freedom of speech needs to be really thought about and considered again. Although it's the First Amendment for a reason. It's the most important thing for society, and it's to link to your point. I think it's very linked to the Judeo-Christian tradition, which most people aren't aware of. And there's I think we discussed this a little bit last time. There's deeper philosophical forces at play, I think, in terms of much of the Western world has, for the most part, lost its faith. And so, you're seeing capitalism replace that faith. And so what you're getting is these, this empire that doesn't really have a direction other than pursuing profit. Whereas, previous Western empires, even though they had their faults, as all empires do, especially if you look historically, but the reason that the West was successful is that it had this, this pursuit of truth, this pursuit of knowledge, which seemingly has gone out the way now, and its profits are more important than truth. And unless people start to kind of really speak up about that, it's devastating. I think I mentioned this previously. There are signs of hope, as I think you are seeing this return to kind of understanding religious ideas and spirituality, but in a more modern sense, not going back to the Christianity of the past, but kind of people like Jordan Peterson and Jonathan Vervaeke, who are talking about spirituality and mythology and the scientific roots from evolutionary biology in these stories, and the importance of the stories to our human makeup. And so their movement is growing, in the United States and the Western world. So, if those people start to, push for truth again, there might be hope. But other than that, it's looking pretty grim at the moment.
And well, that was kind of my next question, looking pretty grim. So, we've been talking a little bit about Iran and the U.S. empire. And, if the U.S. initiates a shooting war with Iran, I think it'll be a far cry from what we've seen so far with Iraq, Afghanistan, Libya, or Yemen. That's the Mexican part of me speaking lemon. So, but what do you think would be the consequences? I mean, if it's a sad, grim thing to discuss, but the consequences of U.S. Iran war, as well as in the context, recently we had the Russian Chinese. You mentioned Iranian war games, and China has today called for calm and restraint following the assassination of the Iranian general. So, I mean, what are the consequences? How do you think Russia and China will be involved? I mean, do you think we're going to see some lower level retaliation from Iran, or I mean, what would be the consequences of a U.S.-Iran war?
Yeah, I mean, this is the kind of the scary aspect of it, is that you never know what's going to happen with war. Um, and it can take the slightest, thing that can just set it off. And, I think World War One is a very good example of that. Something happens in kind of something that seems disconnected from everything, and then all of a sudden it becomes this global conflict. So I can't really predict what's going to happen, but I think I'm thankful for the calls for restraint. The more of that, the better. And it's kind of seemingly in line with what Russia and China have said in terms of, all they're looking for, really, even though I'm sure they have their own ambitions in the region. But I think why they have the support in the region at the moment is they're saying all we want is international sovereignty and rule of law. So I would hope that they're not looking to escalate the situation. But the problem is, I guess, you have national factors at play in terms of, I'm sure people in Iran will not take this attack very lightly, and then there might be pressure on the government to react or show that they're not going to tolerate this. If they just say, okay, America did a bad thing, and shake their finger at them, and then just say, but we're going to follow the law. It might, I don't know the politics of Iran that well, but it might not sit very well with the people. So you might have this situation where there is a lot of pressure on the government to retaliate.
Yeah, there's been some rumblings that they could close the Strait of Hormuz, which could send oil jumping to $150 a barrel. Is there anything else you'd like to mention on the issue of Iran and the Middle East, or any other rumblings you've heard from your network?
Yeah, I mean, it's tough to say, but I think what my feeling is that we're in a very, very critical period. And so, my hope is that people will just, try to engage in this topic and think about it. Part of my concern is actually that the Western world has become so used to conflict in the Middle East, and conflict in all these countries, that no one actually really knows what's going on. No one pays attention anymore. Everyone's got their own, they're wrapped up in whatever, and most young people will probably have no idea of foreign affairs at all. I was walking around today, and I was actually feeling very sad and thinking, a few days ago for the new year, I was feeling really optimistic, and personally some new opportunities were arising. But then today I was, very depressing news. I thought we're definitely on the edge of something catastrophic. I was walking around and it seemed like no one had a clue. Everyone's whatever on their video games, or sounding like an old man now. But yeah, I really don't get the sense that people are that concerned when they, this is a really critical time for the West.
Yeah, I play video games too, but but yeah, I would agree the same with you. This is something that we need to talk about and in our everyday lives with the people around us. Is there anything else? Any final thoughts? I always ask my guests on their final thoughts on anything else going into 2020, whether it's war or peace, activism, media, or censorship, given what happened with you and Newsweek. So any final thoughts to leave us with, whether they be more realistic and grim, or positive and optimistic?
Sure, I'll try and keep it positive. I think, like we mentioned, the media coverage is going to be bad from a Western perspective. So if you do live in those countries, please seek out independent voices. I think we're luckily in a situation now that this has been happening so long that there is a big number of people that are talking about this. The problem is they struggle to get funding, or they need to support themselves through Patreon. So, find out those people that are trying to kind of call for restraint, call for international law, and support them on Patreon or PayPal or whatever means that you can. Various different podcasts, yours included. Please, I'm sure your listeners already support you, but donate some more for the new year. And try and keep speaking about it. Don't raise it with as many people as you can, and because it is very serious, and people need to start waking up about this, I think.
Yes, please do support us. I did get a $50 donation for the new year, so thank you to my listener there. But I'm still running. How would you say? Still not covering the entire cost of the time that I put in and the resources that go into this. So it was a decent year last year, but let's hope listeners help chip in to keep this going, so I can talk to people like yourself and the guests that I do talk to and spread their knowledge and expertise. So I know you're on Twitter, you do have a website, and you do have a Patreon and a PayPal. So how can people best find you, follow you, support your work?
Sure. Probably it's all wrapped up in one place on my website. So it's tareqhaddad.com. So TareqHaddad.com. And we'll have my Twitter and my Patreon and everything. But I appreciate that if you could help.
All right. I urge people to follow Tareq and support him on his Patreon. He is someone who risked his fancy journalist career at Newsweek for his integrity and the truth. I too have gone a semester or two without university courses when I taught as an adjunct because of my non-establishment views on international relations. So I know how it feels. Thanks for the talk, Tareq, and best of luck to you.
Cheers.